Europe is bursting with history and sights. However, our continent can only look back on a pitch-black past. From devastating plague outbreaks and brutal witch hunts to the 2 world wars, the peoples of Europe had to endure unspeakable suffering. And indeed, many relics from these oppressive eras still lie dormant in the earth. Relics that bear witness to the fact that the belief in evil powers even extended beyond death, and which, from today's perspective, simply leaves us speechless. When we have to say goodbye to a loved one, a small world collapses for us. Apart from mourning and remembering, there is only one thing left to do. We want to give our loved ones a dignified farewell. However, the burial site discovered in Poland a few months ago shows that 400 years ago, people treated their deceased a little differently. Well, if they were suspected of being possessed by devilish forces, of course. The researchers came across an unmarked mass cemetery near the village of Pien. While this was dated to between the 16th and 17th centuries, the experts also uncovered the remains of a 6 to 7-year-old boy here, which gives us a deep insight into the superstitions of days long past. The child was not actually buried lying down, but in an upright position with his face downwards and with a heavy triangular iron padlock on his feet. But that's not all. The experts reconstructed that the grave had been dug up after the burial, but they were unable to determine what the people intended to do with the exhumed body. However, it is quite possible that they wanted to burn or destroy it because they were convinced that the boy was a vampire. In fact, the child's burial was even comparatively humane. In the meantime, a whole series of European vampire graves had been discovered, and the people of the time did practically everything they could to prevent the undead creatures from rising from their graves. The idea behind head burial was that the monster would bite into the ground as soon as it awoke. Cutting off the head or legs was supposed to immobilize the monster, but sometimes a heavy stone in the mouth or a stake in the throat testified to the deep fear of the living. The bestial attack still puzzles us today. Some time ago, archaeologists on the Swedish island of Åland made a gruesome discovery. The researchers unearthed the remains of 26 people on the site of the Sandbyborg hill fort. The location and condition of the bones painted a horrifying picture. On a day in the late 5th century, a cold-blooded mass murder was committed in Sandbyborg. The skeletons of the surprised inhabitants showed no signs of a struggle. While women and children were among those killed, the youngest victim was just 3 months old. The following circumstance seems particularly puzzling. After the attackers had committed their bloody deed, they simply left again. They left behind all the valuable possessions of the inhabitants, and the dwellings remained intact. This is also evidenced by the precious jewelry that the experts unearthed here, including 6 gold-plated brooches and a Roman Byzantine gold coin. As a Roman arrowhead was also found, it is conceivable that some of the inhabitants once fought as mercenaries for the Romans and were killed in revenge after the fall of the Roman Empire. However, this is only a theory. At present, no one can say with absolute certainty what led to the bestial act 1,500 years ago. What is certain, however, is that the bodies were not buried after the massacre, but simply left on the spot. The cattle also remained untouched. They died in the cages and enclosures. After the raid, the fortifications were swallowed up by sand over time, which caved in on the houses and at least gave the dead a natural burial. The British Pompeii that nobody knows. Buried in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, Pompeii is considered the prime example of an ancient city that has been perfectly preserved for posterity. But if we now let our gaze wander from Italy to Whittlesea in England, we realize that the British also have their very own Pompeii. Well, almost. While the real Pompeii had a history of 700 years at the time of its demise, the British counterpart was only a few months old when it burned down. Analysis of the wood used showed that the settlement was only inhabited for a short time. Nevertheless, the site gave us an authentic insight into the reality of life for the inhabitants at the time. In the Bronze Age, they produced fine fabrics, had a varied diet, and could rely on an extensive trading network. The archaeologists discovered a total of 5 round houses built on stilts on the moors in eastern England. The Pompeii comparison refers to the excellent degree of preservation. The dwellings contain all their original furnishings, from household items to furniture. Each house contained pots of different sizes, wooden buckets and plates, metal tools, stone tools for grinding grain, and weapons. But high-quality textiles were also part of the basic equipment of every household. These included woven linen fabrics, twine, and bundles of plant fibers. The animal bones discovered showed that wild boar, red deer, calves, lambs, and fish were on the menu at the time. Some of the charred remains of porridge, emmer, and barley were even still in the bowls in which they were served. The origin of the beads found is likely to be in the Mediterranean or the Middle East, and thus testify to the complex trade network of the former inhabitants. Why did this man have a sword hand? 1,500 years ago, a powerful blow struck a man in Italy and severed his right hand. The injury should have killed him, if not from the loss of blood, then from the subsequent infection. But the wounded man survived and replaced the missing part of his body with a long blade. While the razor-sharp prosthesis was attached to the arm with a leather strap, this story demonstrates not only the ingenuity of the people of the time, but also the communal care and family compassion that made the man's survival possible in the first place. After losing his hand, he probably lived for a few more years. He died at the age of around 50. Today, he rests together with his sword hand in the necropolis in northern Italy, surrounded by more than 200 other skeletons and a decapitated horse that was offered as an animal sacrifice. Did Neanderthals eat each other? Well, sometimes they did. In the Belgian caves of Goyet, researchers actually found some gnawed Neanderthal bones, which suggests that they were slaughtered and turned into tools. There is also evidence of cannibalism at sites in other countries. However, since such evidence is not found at every site, the question arises as to why some sites went on to eat each other and others did not. Most experts do not believe that cannibalism was part of a sacred ritual. It is more likely that the Neanderthals started attacking each other out of necessity. According to this, around 120,000 years ago, a warm period set in that permanently changed the landscape. Dense forests now sprouted from the ground, where previously there had been vast grasslands with the usual prey. However, as our extinct relatives were unable to adapt to the new conditions in time, they sometimes had no choice but to eat their own kind. This brutal massacre took place in Germany. What began as the routine construction of a bypass road ultimately brought to light a shocking archaeological sensation. In 2006, some workers in the Hessian municipality of Schonach in the Kleinstadt district came across countless bones in the ground. The experts who were called in discovered that we are dealing here with the remains of at least 26 people who were killed by arrows and blunt force 7,000 years ago. Almost all of the skulls showed severe injuries, while numerous comminuted fractures were found in the arms and legs. However, it appears that the legs were only smashed after the victims had died. Afterwards, the dead were by no means buried with dignity, but carelessly thrown into a mass grave. As the scientists found no younger women among the victims, it is reasonable to conclude that they were abducted by the attackers. The absence of older children is interpreted to mean that they may have managed to escape in the chaos of the attack. The entire community was probably wiped out by a neighboring group of linear pottery, the earliest farming society in Central Europe. However, the reasons for the massacre of Kleinstadt were still obscure. It may have been about territorial claims, resources, or supremacy in the region. What is particularly astonishing is the fact that the settlement continued to exist for around 2 generations after the attack. In fact, the brute force was no exception at the time. Similar incidents took place in Tallinn, in Baden-Württemberg, and Schlitz in Lower Australia. Ötzi had dark skin and a bald head. Ötzi keeps the world in suspense. Discovered in the Ötztal Alps in 1991, the 5,300-year-old ice mummy was instrumental in gaining groundbreaking insights into the lives of European Stone Age people. However, a new study shows that scientists are sometimes on the wrong track with their analyses. because the glacier man actually looked very different than previously thought. This question seemed to have been answered long ago. Otzi's genome was decoded back in 2012, whereupon researchers drew a picture of a typical fair-skinned European who had long, wavy hair and a thick beard. However, we now know that this reconstruction was based on DNA material that was contaminated. The new sequencing technology gives the Iceman a completely different appearance. Otzi's ancestors were mainly peasant immigrants from Anatolia. Only 9% of his genetic material came from European hunter-gatherers. As a result, Otzi's skin color was naturally quite dark, which had nothing to do with exposure to the sun. And he didn't have a thick mane, but a bald head. And if he hadn't been pierced by an arrow and suffered a traumatic brain injury, he might have fallen victim to diabetes. He carried the genetic predisposition for the disease as well as for obesity. Press subscribe now and never miss an exciting video again.